Hey everyone, it's Mariana, and somehow it's March already, so I guess it's time for February wrap-ups. I realized that my last two videos were wrap-ups as well because I ended up posting them a little bit later than usual, and there are other videos I'm working on at the moment, but I thought I should get these out first instead of waiting like I did last time. So let me tell you about everything I read in February. First up, 1984 by George Orwell. This was actually my classic of the month for January, and I did start reading it in January, but I did not finish it until February, so here we are. And the same thing happened with my February classic actually, so we'll be talking about that one in my March wrap-up. But 1984. This was my first time reading George Orwell. I know most of you had to read Orwell in school. I did not because I didn't grow up in the US. I know this is a very respected dystopian classic in the English-speaking world, but it didn't work for me, unfortunately. I am glad that I finally read it because this is something that is referenced a lot and is borrowed from a lot and generally talked about pretty often, but I just did not enjoy it. What's worse is that I didn't really care about what was going on and what was happening to the characters. Sure, there are some interesting themes and the book definitely has some interesting things to say. I am not going to deny that. This was obviously a groundbreaking novel back when it came out, but it didn't work for me and I had a hard time getting into it, and the further I read, the more I couldn't wait for it to end. For me, this falls into this weird category of books that I understand the merit of. I fully respect the work that the author put into it, and there are certainly things to discuss about this. I could talk about this book for quite a while, but it just was not my thing. It also did not help that I read We by Evgeny Zamyatin at the end of last year, and that is the novel that inspired 1984. As much as I try to judge things on their own and take them for what they are without trying to compare them to other things, even if they're inspired by other things, it was impossible not to compare the two because I read them so close together. And I loved We. It worked so much better for me stylistically, emotionally, narratively, the whole package, the characters, everything. I loved that novel, and this kind of paled in comparison. I ended up giving 1984 2 out of 5 stars. Unfortunately, it was just not for me at all, and it did not help that the characters in this novel are pretty much there to be vessels for the author's ideas and not really there to be developed as actual characters. I am definitely going to be checking out more Orwell in the future. I do want to give him another chance, but this was sadly a big miss. Next up, thankfully, I read a book that I loved so much, and that is The Immortalists by Chloe Benjamin. The funny thing is that I wasn't really planning to read this in the first place. This was kind of an impulse read, and I didn't really know much about it aside from the basic premise. 4 siblings go see a psychic as kids, and she tells each of them the date of their death. After that, the book follows their lives one at a time, switching to the perspective of the next sibling once the previous one dies. If you are like me and you love character-driven stories, you absolutely have to read The Immortalists because Chloe Benjamin does a fantastic job with her characters. They feel like real people. They are complex, they are flawed, they are relatable, and they are just so interesting to follow. They have very different lives, they're very different people, but I was fascinated by every single one of them. I loved the characters in this book. As you can imagine, with a premise like this, the book raises questions of fate versus free will, and we see how each of the characters is affected by the prophecy of their death. This isn't a particularly new theme in literature. This is actually something that authors talk about quite a lot in their books, but this is a theme that I find very interesting and I love reading about stuff like this. So that was a big plus for me. My only small issue with this novel is that the author doesn't really give a lot of room for interpretation once everything is done. She doesn't really let the reader kind of make up their mind about the questions that she raises, and she gives a lot of the answers. At the same time, I can't really blame the author for getting her point of view across, but I do wish she would let her readers make those decisions on their own instead of feeding them most of the answers. But generally, I absolutely loved this. I ended up rating the Immortalists 4.5 out of 5 stars, and I would 100% recommend this to anyone who loves literary fiction that is character driven and beautifully written. Then I read Circe by Marianna Neal, and this is something that I actually ended up enjoying a lot more than I expected. I don't really have great luck with retellings, and this is a retelling. This is based on Greek mythology, and this is a retelling of the myth of Circe. And I think I found a loophole to my problems with retellings, because the few retellings that I enjoyed were based on mythology, so I think that's the key for me. Anyways, back to Circe. What Marianna Neal does here is she makes Circe a character you can genuinely root for and empathize with. We see her struggles and we understand how and why she becomes this feared witch that is often interpreted as evil. This is definitely a very character-driven retelling. Surprise, surprise, I liked another character-driven book. But there is enough going on here to keep almost any reader interested. There are gods, monsters, heroes, villains, love, witchcraft, and on, all of the good stuff that you would expect from mythology. It's also worth noting that you don't really have to be a Greek mythology buff in order to enjoy it, because first of all, the author sets up everything that happens and all of the characters really well, but also there is this reference section at the end, so if you are confused, you can look at that. So I really don't think anyone is going to be confused by this. The only real issue I had with this book was that it felt very even. And what I mean by that is, even though there were things happening throughout the novel that felt like they would be a big deal, it was all kind of one tone, and they didn't really feel like the ups and downs of storytelling that you would normally expect from a novel. The events seem like they would feel major, but they never really felt like it. Partly it's because of the tone, partly it's because of the storytelling style, but in general, the book felt very one level, which is a bit unfortunate. I did hope for more of those, as I mentioned, ups and downs that you would expect from storytelling. But I still really liked it, and I ended up giving it a solid 4 out of 5. I would absolutely read more Marianna Neal in the future. I would definitely recommend this book, and particularly I would recommend the audiobook because the narrator did an exceptional job. I also attempted to read The Terror by Dan Simmons, and I say attempted because I ended up giving up on it about halfway through. I rarely abandon books, and I think most of you would know that if you followed me for a while, but I just didn't feel like this was worth pushing through. I originally picked this up because of the TV series and it looked very interesting, but I wanted to read the book before watching the series, and in retrospect, I think I should have just watched the series, and I'm just going to do that without finishing the novel. This is historical fiction with horror elements mixed in. It is based on the Franklin expedition that set out to find the Northwest Passage in 1845, and I found this very drawn out, overly detailed, and generally tedious to read. On top of that, it lacked interesting characters or characters that I could see myself caring about even at some point later in the book. I did enjoy the bits that had to do with the monster on the ice, but that is not what the majority of the book was. And it's not like I need every book to be a fast-paced thriller or anything like that. No, I actually love long books. I love when they're complex and epic and they're rich with setting and characters characters and all of that, but the terror is not that. This book wanted to let me know every detail of canning food in the 1800s, like how the process works and all of that, just to let me know that the food has gone bad. No rating here because I only read half of the novel, so I didn't feel like it was fair to rate it, but if I had to, I would probably rate it somewhere around 2 out of 5 stars. Last, but certainly not least, I read Vengeful by V.E. Schwab, which is the sequel to Vicious, and I love Vicious. Vengeful is something I felt very skeptical about, particularly because I did not feel like Vicious needed a sequel, so when I heard there was going to be one, I was immediately not a big fan of the idea. And by the way, if you want to hear my thoughts on Vicious, I do have a very old review of this on my channel. I will link it for you down below, but do not judge it too harshly because it's one of my first book reviews that I've done, so it's a little awkward. Turns out I had pretty much nothing to worry about with Vengeful. This was a solid sequel. I burned through it and I really enjoyed it. I mean, it's anti-heroes with superpowers. What's not to like? Now, it's impossible to talk about Vengeful without spoiling Vicious, so all I'm going to say is that we have beloved characters from the first book that you would expect to see, plus a few new characters with some really cool powers. And you do see all of them use their powers plenty, which is always exciting. There are some interesting character dynamics. There is some very compelling backstory for Eli, which made me care about Eli. And if you've read Vicious, you know how crazy that is. There is this whole mob subplot, which is quite fun. Basically, this book is good times, and this is coming from somebody who didn't need this book to exist in the first place, or so I thought. I will say that all of the different timelines here were a bit of an overkill. This is something that worked really well in the first book, but here the author takes it to a whole new level and it gets to a point where it's actually a bit confusing. Pretty much everything has its own timeline. Calm down, V. Schwab. And related to that, the middle section felt a little bit drawn out and unfocused, but this is kind of a minor complaint because I was still very interested in everything that was going on in this book. Pretty much enjoyed, as I mentioned, very much. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. This is a very solid sequel. And you know what? I would absolutely be down for book 3 in the series sometime down the road. Just sign me up for that because I need more of all of this in my life. And that's it for this wrap up. Let me know what you guys read in February in the comments below, and also talk to me about all of these books that I read because I know all of them are pretty popular, so I'm sure you've read at least 1 or 2 of these and I'm sure you have some things to say. So let's discuss in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe to my channel. You know what to do. I hope you're having an amazing day, and I will see you very soon with my movie and TV wrap up. Bye.